I'm not against architecture. I'm an architectural historian. I make my living through architecture, but I think that we have enough buildings, and at least in Europe and maybe in America, there are enough buildings. We don't need any more buildings. It is really either speculation or vanity that drives this lustful atmosphere of building all these buildings. I can forgive some of them. Some buildings are useful, but I think that we need to change our priorities. Very successful architects, I'm not going to mention any names, but they were at the conference here in Barcelona that was organized by Arquitectura y Sociedad. So we've just been through a big conference, and I don't want to mention names because it should be obvious, but there is a certain cast of star architects that participate hand in glove with multinational corporations and produce iconic projects which are really a form of marketing that create symbols of distinction that might be nice to look at, but in fact are working to continue the process of global warming, just as advertising for corporations. So one just needs to recognize this. It doesn't seem obvious, but it is obvious that this is a problem, and that the priorities of architecture are not in the right place. There are some people that are doing very good work. As I mentioned, I don't think there's going to be a great need to make buildings in the future. We need to adjust buildings, perhaps, but in Europe, we have too many buildings, especially in Spain and Italy, and a bit in Greece. There's a huge amount of empty buildings that came from the building boom from 2000 and 2008. So what's the job of there's no work for architects. So that's the first thing to recognize. And in most architecture schools, they don't seem to care about that. And so what I teach my students, or what I'm trying to convince them, is that they should become agritechs, that they should become sensible to the organic world surrounding them that involves water, land, and plants. 99.7% of all the life on the planet is plant life, and it's been here much longer than we have, and it actually is more intelligent than we are. It has a higher survival rate than we have, and we need to learn from the plants. I don't really teach how to make architecture. I try to teach people about theories of architecture, but I think one of the most interesting theories of architecture today that you could open up to is what you would call biomimetic architecture, where you don't look like something biological, but you conceptually try to reproduce what plants have done very successfully. If we're allowed to breathe, it's because of plants. They produce the oxygen. Our buildings should do the same thing, and they can, if we studied how to do this. Buildings can, in fact, produce oxygen. At the Expo last year in Milan, the Austrian pavilion proved that in the building of the Austrian pavilion, they made oxygen using plants, but there are some high-tech architects like Norman Foster who understand this. They do it. I have great trouble with high-tech architects because they tend to create a great deal of embodied energy in every project they make. These projects are very expensive, they're very elite, and they're not for the rest of the world. They're for special projects. So I have a little trouble endorsing what Norman Foster does, but I think still he's on the right track of trying to make an architecture that is bioclimatic or biomimetic, because they're two different things, but still he's been quite successful in doing this. So what should architects learn? Well, yes, they should learn something about this. I think they need to be increasingly sensitive to people, because people don't want them. So if they want to be wanted, they need to know who the people are. We need to read novels, go to films, and be sociologically sensitive. to these people. The word empathy was brought up at the end. I don't know if these architects really have it, but it is a good ingredient of one's character to have empathy. And it's not something that you can learn from a book. It means you need to go out into the world. So when I think of Earth service as a form of building citizenship, it's also so that you can know people, so that you can see how other people are doing things. Most architects are formed in a very cloistered environment with a professional who tries to create an imitation of themselves as a kind of failed genius. So I think we could fail in other ways, and that we might just be successful farmers to the beginning. Know how to grow food, know how to do it yourself, know how to build. How many architects could build a building by themselves, do you think? You know? I much prefer to lead people towards what you call autocostruzione, self-building, to use minimal of concrete, because concrete leads to 4% of global warming. We can find alternative materials. One of the most interesting materials, which you can smoke it and get high, but it's cannabis. So, and in Spain, there's a woman who, since 20 years, has been making what she calls cannabricks, and it's a good alternative to other building materials, and it's completely biodegradable. Then there's a whole lot of biodegradable materials that you can be using to make architecture, but we tend not to study this. So, there's very few people that actually teach you about biodegradable materials. If they do, they just do it for 5 minutes and then you go on. But most architecture, I've always asked architects, even in this group, I say, when you start a project, what's the material that's in your mind when you're making the drawing? And it's always concrete. So some people are thinking in wood, which is okay, but it's expensive. But most people are thinking in concrete when they do a drawing. So it's like, could we start, when we start to think about a building, think about these materials, because they're becoming increasingly important in the balance of the things that cause global warming. If I think of what an architect should do, it's actually not so much the building as the city. If we really had our priorities organized in the correct way, we would be working on neighborhoods to create a consciousness in a neighborhood, such has been done in the Vauban neighborhood of Freiburg, for instance, which you can use as a model, where through a political process that involved a city government, developers, and neighborhood groups that had to meet for 15 years to organize their system, they created a fantastic order that if you wanted to have an automobile in this neighborhood, you'd have to pay the equivalent of 17,000 euro to park your car, which is a great inhibitor to having an automobile. 1 in 800 people who live in Vauban have an automobile. As a result, the other people rent cars, they have car sharing, they use public transportation, which is very good, and they ride bicycles. And it's much easier for transport to work that way. They also have rearranged the way they live in their houses to create zero-carbon houses through good insulation, through proper windows, through photovoltaic panels, and through geothermal heating systems. And it's diffused throughout this neighborhood of 5,000 people. 5,000 to 10,000 people is a very good amount to work with. So we might start thinking of ourselves as groups of 5,000 to 10,000 people, rather than thinking of ourselves as a metropolis or as a big city, because you cannot accomplish something on a huge scale, but you can on this scale of 5,000 to 10,000 people. An individual house doesn't matter at all for me. It's the neighborhood that matters, because it is truly a social process. People have to live together, they have to share space, and they share services, and eventually they live a very happy existence. So if you want to know where it works, go to Freiburg and visit this neighborhood, and you realize it is possible. And it's possible, but you can't do it overnight, and you need to go through a consensual process to really make it work. There are other places in France, in particular, they're creating what are called éco-quartiers, and these are for neighborhoods of about 10,000 people, so it corresponds to Vauban. But it's done through a ministry and done top-down, so that there is no community organization that is supporting it. But don't think poorly of it. It's correct to do it. In other words, it's all right. It's going to lead to a more sustainable environment. It might not lead to a sustainable society, a community. It's too early to know. There's 6 of them that are being built, and there's others that are converting to what you call an éco-quartier. You could go to other places in Germany. Germany is the best country in Europe at the moment for doing this. And we could go to Trento in Italy, where a not completely positive example occurred. I'm about to go to a place in Spain called Marina Leda, which wasn't planned to be sustainable, but it is, from a social point of view, very interesting because maybe you know about it. It's a cooperative. It's a city of 3,000 people, so it's not very big. It's like a neighborhood that, through their political guidance, and it may be a dictatorship, I don't know. I have to find out. That's why I'm going. They get paid €1,200 a month, and they pay €15 a month rent. In a depressed economy of Andalusia, where there's 36% unemployment, it's a miracle. And you wonder, this might be a very popular solution to a real problem that most of us have. In other words, I think sustainability could be social, economic, and environmental. In France, they're working mostly on the environmental part, and that involves architects and technicians. But if the social part isn't there, I have an intimation that it might not be completely successful. So we'll have to see. It's too early to see.